For 43 years I was a leader, respected, even feared, but it was all built on a lie that I helped create. Families sold their homes, gave up their dreams, because I told them the end was coming in 1975, but the end never came. What happened afterward is darker than you can possibly imagine. My name is Harold. I'm 74 years old today, and if there's one thing I've learned in all these years, it's that sometimes the most painful truths are the ones we discover about ourselves. I'm sitting here in my small apartment in Ohio, looking at a photograph from 1974. There I am, standing tall and proud in front of our Kingdom Hall, wearing my best suit, with my wife Evelyn beside me in her modest dress, both of us beaming with absolute certainty that we knew God's plan for humanity. But that man in the photograph, that confident elder who commanded respect from an entire congregation, that man was living in a carefully constructed lie. And the saddest part, I was one of the architects of that lie. You see, my dear friends, I spent 43 years as one of Jehovah's Witnesses. 22 of those years, I served as an elder, what they call a spiritual shepherd, someone entrusted with guiding the flock, making decisions about people's lives, their worthiness, their very salvation. I was respected, even feared by some. When I spoke from the platform during meetings, the entire congregation hung on every word. When families had problems, they came to me for counsel. When someone needed to be disciplined or, God forbid, expelled from the organization, I was often the one making that terrible decision. But this isn't a story about power or prestige. This is a story about what happens when you give your entire life to a promise that was never meant to be kept. If you're watching this channel, you probably know someone who's been touched by the Jehovah's Witnesses, or maybe you've had them knock on your door. What you might not know is how deep their control goes, how completely they can consume a person's life, family, and future. I'm here to tell you my story because I believe you have the right to know the truth. Not their version of truth, but what really happens behind those Kingdom Hall doors. It all started innocently enough, back in 1958. I was 31 years old, working as a high school history teacher in a small town in Ohio. Evelyn and I had been married for 8 years, and we were that typical American couple of the late 50s. We had our little house with a white picket fence, our Sunday dinners after church, our plans for the future. We attended the local Methodist church, not out of any deep conviction, but because that's what decent people did in those days. "Harold," Evelyn said to me one Tuesday morning as she was hanging laundry on our backyard line, "there are some nice people at the door who want to talk to us about the Bible." I remember that moment so clearly because it was the beginning of everything. The two women standing on our front porch looked so earnest, so sincere. They introduced themselves as Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Cole, and they carried leather book bags and had that particular glow that people get when they believe they're doing something tremendously important. Mrs. Patterson was probably in her 50s, with grey hair pinned back neatly and kind blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Mrs. Cole was younger, maybe late 30s, with a warm smile and a voice so gentle it could calm a crying baby. They didn't look like dangerous people. They looked like the kind of women you'd want as neighbors. "We're sharing an encouraging message from the Bible," Mrs. Patterson explained, opening a colorful book called "The Truth Shall Make You Free." "Would you be interested in learning what God's kingdom will mean for mankind?" Now, I was a history teacher, so I thought I knew the Bible reasonably well, but these women presented concepts I'd never heard in all my years of Methodist services. They talked about paradise on earth, about a government established by God that would solve all human problems, about how death wasn't natural, but was actually an enemy that would be destroyed. "The Bible promises," Mrs. Cole said, pointing to a beautiful illustration of families playing with lions and tigers in a garden setting, "that God will make all things new. No more war, no more sickness, no more death. And this will happen right here on earth." Evelyn squeezed my hand. I could see the wonder in her eyes. After losing her younger brother in Korea just a few years earlier, the promise of a world without war spoke directly to her heart. That first study lasted 2 hours. By the time they left, we had agreed to a weekly Bible study every Tuesday afternoon. As I watched them walk down our street to the next house, their book bags swinging with purpose, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Genuine excitement about spiritual matters. The studies progressed beautifully. Every week, Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Cole would arrive punctually at 2:30 p.m., and we'd sit around our kitchen table, going through their publications page by page. They used a method of teaching that was remarkably effective. They would ask questions, then help us find the answers in the Bible itself. It felt like we were making discoveries, uncovering truths that had been hidden from us our entire lives. Within 6 months, Evelyn and I were attending meetings at the Kingdom Hall 3 times a week. The hall was a simple, functional building on Maple Street. No stained glass windows or ornate decorations like our old Methodist church. Just rows of metal chairs facing a modest platform with a wooden podium. But there was something powerful about the atmosphere there. Everyone seemed so focused, so united in their beliefs, so absolutely certain that they possessed the only true religion on earth. I'll never forget the first time I heard Brother Williams, the presiding overseer, explain Bible prophecy. He stood at that podium with such authority, tracing events from Daniel and Revelation, showing how everything was pointing to our time period, how we were living in the last days before God's kingdom would replace all human governments. The evidence is overwhelming, he declared, his voice carrying to every corner of that packed hall. We are the generation that will see the end of this wicked system of things. The congregation murmured in agreement. Some nodded their heads vigorously. A few elderly sisters wiped tears from their eyes. And I felt that electric feeling you get when you realize you're part of something much bigger than yourself, something historically significant. That night, walking home under the streetlights with Evelyn, I made a decision that would shape the next 4 decades of my life. "Evelyn," I said, stopping under the old oak tree at the corner of our street, "I think we've found the truth." She looked up at me with those trusting brown eyes, the same eyes that had looked at me when I proposed, when we'd made our wedding vows, when we dreamed about our future together. "I know we have, Harold," she whispered. "I can feel it in my heart." 6 months later, in June of 1959, both Evelyn and I were baptized at a circuit assembly in Columbus. I can still remember the feeling of going under that water, the sensation of every sin, every doubt, every past mistake being washed away. When I came up gasping for air, I wasn't just Harold anymore. I was Brother Harold, a dedicated servant of Jehovah God, a publisher of the good news, a member of the only organization on earth that had God's approval. The transformation in our lives was immediate and total. We stopped celebrating Christmas, birthdays, and holidays, understanding that these were pagan traditions that displeased God. We ended friendships with people who couldn't accept our new beliefs. We distanced ourselves from family members who questioned our decision. We rearranged our entire schedule around the organization's activities. Tuesday book study, Thursday ministry school, Sunday watchtower study, Saturday morning field service. And through it all, one message was drummed into us week after week, assembly after assembly. Time was running out. The end was near. God's kingdom was about to take action against this wicked world, and only dedicated Jehovah's Witnesses would survive. By 1962, I had become what they called a ministerial servant, essentially an assistant to the elders, helping with the practical aspects of congregation life. I carried the microphones during meetings, managed the literature counter, and assisted with the weekly book study group that met in our living room every Tuesday evening. Evelyn had blossomed into what the organization considered an exemplary Christian woman. She spent 30 hours a month going door to door, conducted Bible studies with interested women, and had that gentle, submissive demeanor that the Watchtower publications constantly praised. Our house became a hub of spiritual activity. Every Tuesday night, 15 to 20 people would crowd into our modest living room. Sitting on folding chairs we'd set up in neat rows, studying the latest Watchtower publication paragraph by paragraph. I would read the questions aloud, and various members of the group would raise their hands to answer, always careful to use the exact language from the printed material. "Brother Harold," Sister Martinez would say, her weathered hands clutching her well-worn Bible, "the Watchtower explains that we're living in the last days of the last days. How blessed we are to be part of God's organization during these critical times." Those were the kinds of comments that earned approval. Comments that showed complete acceptance of whatever the organization taught, no matter how complex or seemingly contradictory. I learned to nod approvingly, to say, "Very good, Sister Martinez," even when doubts occasionally flickered in the back of my mind. The doubt never lasted long, though. The organization had a remarkable system for dealing with questions or concerns. If you ever wondered about a teaching, you were encouraged to wait on Jehovah for clarification, to trust that the faithful and discreet slave class, the small group of men in Brooklyn who claimed to be God's channel of communication, would provide new light when the time was right. Questioning was not forbidden outright, but it was strongly discouraged as a sign of spiritual weakness, or worse, dangerous pride. Brother Williams took me under his wing during those early years. He was a man in his late 50s, with silver hair combed straight back and an air of absolute certainty about everything. He had been with the organization since the 1940s and had that kind of deep, authoritative voice that made even simple statements sound profound. "Harold," he told me one evening after a particularly intense elders meeting, "I've been watching you, and I see leadership potential. The organization needs men like you, educated, articulate, completely devoted to the truth." Those words meant everything to me. In my previous life as a school teacher, I had felt purposeful, but not particularly special. Here, in this spiritual paradise, I was being groomed for real responsibility, eternal responsibility. The organization taught us that elders would continue their role even in the new world, helping to educate resurrected humans about God's ways. It wasn't just a temporary position, it was preparation for an eternal assignment. In 1965, at the age of 38, I was appointed as an elder. The announcement was made from the platform during the Thursday night meeting, and I can still remember the warm applause that filled the Kingdom Hall. Evelyn beamed with pride beside me. After the meeting, dozens of congregation members came up to congratulate us, to tell me how much they looked forward to my spiritual guidance. "Brother Harold," old Brother Peterson said, gripping my hand with both of his, "I've been praying for years that Jehovah would provide us with young, capable shepherds. You're an answer to prayer." The responsibilities came immediately. I was now part of the small group of men who made all the important decisions for our congregation of 120 publishers. We determined who could be baptized, who needed counseling for spiritual weakness, who should be reproved publicly for wrongdoing, and who should be disfellowshipped, completely cut off from all association with family and friends in the organization. Those judicial meetings were held in a small back room of the Kingdom Hall, usually on weekday evenings after the regular meetings had ended. 3 elders would sit behind a simple table with the accused person sitting alone on a chair, facing us. I remember the first time I participated in one of these sessions. A young man named David, maybe 22 years old, who had been caught in what they called loose conduct with his girlfriend. "David," Brother Williams began in his most serious tone, "do you understand the gravity of your actions? Do you realize how your behavior has brought reproach upon Jehovah's name and his organization?" The young man's face was flushed with shame and fear. His hands trembled as he tried to explain that they had been planning to marry, that things had just gotten out of hand, that he was truly repentant. But the organization's rules were clear. Certain behaviors required certain consequences, regardless of circumstances or intentions. I watched as this young man, someone I had known since he was a teenager, broke down completely under our questioning. We asked for details that no human being should have to share with 3 older men. We probed his motives, his thoughts, his level of repentance. We held his spiritual life and his relationship with every person he loved in our hands. "The committee has decided," Brother Williams announced after we had sent David out to wait in the main hall while we deliberated, "that you will be publicly reproved. This means you cannot comment at meetings, go out in field service, or have any privileges in the congregation for a minimum of 6 months." The relief on David's face was palpable. Public reproof was humiliating, but it wasn't disfellowshipping. He could still attend meetings, still associate with his family and friends. But I'll never forget the look in his eyes, a mixture of gratitude and something else, something that looked almost like fear of the men who had just decided his fate. As the years passed, I became more entrenched in the organization's hierarchy and more convinced of our special status as God's chosen people. The meetings, the assemblies, the constant study of Watchtower publications, it all reinforced the same central message. We alone had the truth. We alone would survive the coming destruction. We alone were truly pleasing to God. The organization's literature painted a vivid picture of the imminent end of this wicked system of things. Every natural disaster, every war, every social problem was evidence that we were living in the final moments before Armageddon. The Watchtower magazines contained detailed charts and timelines showing how Bible prophecies were being fulfilled in our day, how all the pieces were falling into place for God's final judgment. Brother Williams would often point to current events during his talks from the platform. "Brothers and sisters," he would say, holding up that week's newspaper, "look around you. Wars and reports of wars, earthquakes in diverse places, pestilences, food shortages, everything Jesus predicted is happening right now, in our lifetime." The congregation would nod in solemn agreement. We felt like insiders, like people who had been given advance knowledge of the most important event in human history. While the rest of the world went about their daily lives, completely unaware of their impending doom, we were preparing for survival and for the privilege of inheriting a paradise earth. Evelyn and I made all our life decisions based on this imminent expectation. We never bought a house, choosing instead to rent a small apartment near the Kingdom Hall. We never had children, believing that the end was too close to bring babies into this dying world. We kept our possessions to a minimum, knowing that material things would be meaningless after Armageddon. Every choice was filtered through the question, how will this affect our spiritual standing when the end comes? The sense of urgency was intoxicating. Every day felt significant, every meeting felt crucial, every hour spent in field service felt like it could be the hour when we found the person whose life we would save by bringing them into the organization. We lived in a state of constant spiritual adrenaline, always watching for signs, always expecting the fulfillment of prophecy, always convinced that we were part of the most important work being done on earth. But it was more than just excitement. There was also tremendous pressure. The organization made it clear that survival depended not just on believing the right things, but on doing the right things. There were quotas for field service hours, expectations for meeting attendance, standards for dress and grooming, rules for recreation and entertainment. Every aspect of life was regulated, and deviation from these standards could result in loss of privileges or worse. "Remember, brothers," Brother Williams would remind us during elders' meetings, "we are the shepherds of God's flock. If we become lax in our own spirituality, if we fail to set the proper example, we will have blood guilt on our hands when Armageddon comes." Blood guilt, the teaching that if we failed to warn people about the coming destruction, or if we didn't live up to our responsibilities as spiritual leaders, we would be held accountable for the deaths of those who perished. It was a heavy burden, one that kept us all in line, one that made questioning or doubt seem not just spiritually dangerous, but potentially murderous. By the early 1970s, I had been serving as an elder for nearly a decade. I was 44 years old, respected throughout the circuit, often invited to give talks at assemblies and conventions. Evelyn had pioneered, spent 90 hours a month in door-to-door work for 3 consecutive years. We were considered a model couple, an example of what dedicated service to Jehovah looked like. But there was something else happening in the organization during those years, something that would change everything for people like us. The leadership in Brooklyn was becoming increasingly specific about when the end would come. It wasn't enough anymore to say it was near or imminent. They were now pointing to specific dates, specific years, specific expectations that went far beyond anything they had taught before. And the year they were pointing to, the year that would become the focal point of everything we believed and hoped for, was 1975. The first time I heard about 1975, it was during a circuit assembly in the spring of 1968. Brother Frederick Franz, who was then the vice president of the Watchtower Society, had come to give a special talk about Bible chronology. The assembly hall was packed with over 2,000 delegates from congregations across Ohio, and you could feel the electricity in the air as this man, considered one of the organization's greatest Bible scholars, approached the podium. "Dear brothers and sisters," Franz began, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system, "we are living in the most exciting time in human history. Through careful study of God's Word, we can determine that we are now very close to the end of 6,000 years of human existence." He went on to explain the organization's chronological calculations, showing how Adam was created in 4026 BCE, how 6,000 years would end in the fall of 1975, and how this would likely mark the beginning of Christ's 1,000-year reign. The implications were staggering. We weren't just living in the last days anymore, we were living in the last few years, possibly the last few months. Now, we're not saying definitively that Armageddon will come in 1975, Franz continued with a slight smile, but wouldn't it be wonderful if it did? The applause was thunderous. People were crying, hugging each other, practically vibrating with excitement. Evelyn grabbed my hand so tightly, I thought she might break my fingers. This wasn't just hope anymore. This was virtual certainty based on Bible mathematics, delivered by God's organization through its most trusted spokesman. After that assembly, everything changed. The urgency that had always been part of our faith became almost frantic. Kingdom Hall talks focused constantly on 1975 and what it would mean. The Watchtower magazines published article after article about the significance of the date. Circuit overseers visiting our congregation would ask pointed questions about what we were doing to prepare for the end. Brother Harold, our new circuit overseer Brother Mason, said during his visit in 1969, "How are you helping your congregation understand the significance of the times we're living in? Are they making the necessary adjustments in their lives?" The pressure to make adjustments was enormous. Young people were encouraged to skip college and focus on preaching. Married couples were told to postpone having children. Everyone was urged to simplify their lives, reduce their material possessions, and increase their spiritual activities. The message was clear. Anything that would distract from the final push before Armageddon was not just unwise, it was spiritually dangerous. I threw myself into promoting this message with everything I had. During my talks from the platform, I would paint vivid pictures of what 1975 might bring. I encouraged families to sell their homes and rent instead, arguing that property ownership was a worldly entanglement that could hinder their spiritual focus. I counseled young men to avoid career advancement that might require long-term commitments beyond 1975. Think about it, brothers, I would say, looking out at the packed Kingdom Hall. If Armageddon comes in 1975, what good will your college degree do you? What value will your retirement savings have? The only investment that matters now is the time and energy you put into serving Jehovah. The response was incredible. Families began making radical life changes based on our encouragement. Brother and Sister Thompson sold their successful restaurant and used the money to support themselves as full-time pioneers. Young David Martinez dropped out of his engineering program to spend more time in field service. Sister Williams liquidated her late husband's estate and donated half the proceeds to the organization. But it wasn't just individual decisions. The entire culture of our congregation shifted. Conversations that once might have been about work, family, or hobbies now revolved entirely around 1975 and the New World. We spent hours speculating about what the new system would be like, where we might live in paradise, which dead relatives we were most excited to see resurrected. "Harold," Evelyn said one evening as we were walking home from a particularly intense meeting about 1975, "do you think we'll recognize each other right away when we're perfected? Do you think we'll remember our life together in this old system?" These weren't idle questions. They reflected the complete transformation in how we viewed our present lives. Everything we were experiencing was temporary, a brief prelude to our real existence in God's new world. Our current struggles, our relationships, even our love for each other, it all felt somehow provisional, like we were just marking time until our true lives could begin. The organization's publications became even more specific as 1975 approached. The book, Life Everlasting in Freedom of the Sons of God, published in 1966, contained detailed chronological charts showing exactly how the 6,000 years would end in the fall of 1975. Circuit assemblies featured talks with titles like "What Will You Be Doing in 1975?" and "The Urgency of Our Times." Even the organization's internal correspondence, which occasionally filtered down to the elders, contained references to the expectation that the end would come within the decade. During one particularly memorable elders meeting in 1972, Brother Williams showed us a letter from the circuit overseer that contained what he called encouraging reminders about the approaching end. "Brothers," Williams read aloud, "we want to make sure that all our appointed men understand the unique privilege we have of serving during these final years of this system. The organization expects that elders will take the lead in making whatever life adjustments are necessary to maximize their effectiveness in the remaining time." The letter went on to suggest that elders should consider whether their current employment, living situations, or family circumstances were compatible with the demands of the final push before Armageddon. It wasn't quite a directive, but the implication was clear. If you weren't making significant sacrifices for 1975, you weren't fully grasping the significance of the times. That night, I went home and had the most important conversation of my marriage. Evelyn and I sat at our little kitchen table, the same table where we had conducted our first Bible study 14 years earlier, and I told her that I thought we needed to make some major changes. "Evelyn," I began, reaching across to take her hands, "I think Jehovah is calling us to step out in faith. My teaching job, our comfortable routine, I think it's all holding us back from giving our best to the organization during these crucial years." Her eyes searched my face, looking for certainty in a decision that would affect everything we had built together. "What are you saying, Harold?" "I'm saying we should sell the house. I should resign from teaching. We should use whatever money we have to support ourselves as pioneers until the end comes. We can trust that Jehovah will provide for us in the new system." The silence stretched between us for what felt like hours. Finally, Evelyn squeezed my hands and nodded slowly. "If you think that's what Jehovah wants, Harold, then that's what we'll do." Within 6 months, we had sold our house, liquidated our savings account, and I had submitted my resignation to the school district. The house sale netted us about $18,000. Not a fortune, but enough to live modestly for a few years if we were careful. I figured that by the time the money ran out, we'd either be in the new system or close enough to it that material concerns wouldn't matter anymore. The congregation was amazed by our decision. During the next circuit assembly, our circuit overseer used us as an example of the kind of faith that was needed in these last days. "Look at Brother and Sister Harold," he announced from the platform, gesturing toward where we sat in the front section reserved for pioneers. "Here's a couple who understood the times we're living in. Brother Harold gave up a secure teaching position. They sold their home. They simplified their lives completely to focus on the most important work being done on earth today." The applause was overwhelming. People came up to us during the lunch break to congratulate us on our faith, to tell us how inspiring our example was, to ask for advice about their own life decisions. I felt like a spiritual celebrity, a man who had proven his absolute trust in Jehovah's organization. But as 1974 turned into 1975, something strange began to happen. The confidence that had sustained me through our radical life changes started to develop small cracks. Not doubts about the organization or the truth. I would never have allowed myself to think such thoughts, but little worries about practical matters that I tried to push away. Our money was running lower than I had anticipated. The modest apartment we rented was fine for 2 people, but it felt cramped and temporary in a way that had started to bother me. Evelyn never complained, but I could see the stress in her face when she thought I wasn't looking. She had taken a part-time cleaning job to help make ends meet, and I could see her hands becoming rough and red from the harsh chemicals she used. More troubling were the questions that some congregation members had started asking during our weekly book study. Brother Peterson, who had always been one of the most faithful attendees, raised his hand one Tuesday evening with an unusually serious expression. "Brother Harold," he said slowly, "what if 1975 comes and goes and the end doesn't come? What then?" The question hung in the air like something dangerous. I could feel the tension in the room as everyone waited for my response. These people had made significant life changes based partly on my encouragement. They had trusted me, trusted the organization, trusted the whole timeline we had been promoting for years. "Brother Peterson," I replied, drawing on the standard organizational responses I had heard at assemblies, "we need to remember that our faith shouldn't depend on specific dates. Even if our understanding of the timing isn't perfect, that doesn't change the fact that we're living in the last days. The end is still near, whether it comes in 1975 or a few years later." But even as I said the words, I could hear how hollow they sounded. If the end might not come in 1975, why had we been so certain? Why had the organization encouraged such radical life changes? Why had I resigned from a job I loved and sold a house that had been our security? As the year progressed, these doubts became harder to suppress. The organization's publications began subtly shifting their language about 1975, talking more about it being the end of 6,000 years of human existence, rather than specifically being the date of Armageddon. Circuit overseers started including disclaimers in their talks about not running ahead of the organization or putting too much emphasis on specific dates. "Remember, brothers," our circuit overseer said during his fall visit, "the faithful slave has never said definitively that Armageddon would come in 1975. They have simply pointed out the significance of that date according to Bible chronology." But I remembered the assemblies, the talks, the publications that had seemed so much more definitive than that. I remembered Brother Franz's confident presentations, the Watchtower articles that had calculated the end of 6,000 years down to the month. Had I misunderstood something? Had the organization actually been more cautious than I remembered? The final months of 1975 were a strange mixture of anticipation and growing anxiety. Some congregation members seemed more excited than ever, convinced that the end would come before the year was out. Others had begun showing signs of doubt or fatigue, attending meetings less regularly, or seeming distracted during the programs. Evelyn and I found ourselves in an odd position. We had given up everything for this moment, and now that it was actually arriving, I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Would Armageddon literally begin on a specific date? Would there be warning signs? Would it happen gradually or all at once? "Harold," Evelyn said one evening in November as we sat in our little apartment listening to the radio, "what do you think will happen to us if the end doesn't come this year?" It was the first time either of us had actually voiced the possibility out loud. The question terrified me, not just because of the practical implications, but because of what it might mean about everything we had believed, everything we had sacrificed, everything we had taught others to believe. "It will come, Evelyn," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Maybe not exactly on December 31st, but soon, very soon." December arrived with unusual warmth for Ohio, as if even the weather was refusing to cooperate with our expectations of dramatic change. The congregation meetings took on an almost surreal quality, with everyone pretending that everything was normal while secretly watching the calendar and wondering what would happen when 1975 ended and the world continued on as it always had. On December 30th, we had our regular Tuesday night book study in our living room. 15 people crowded into the small space, studying an article about maintaining faith during times of testing. The irony wasn't lost on any of us, though no one mentioned it directly. As the evening ended and people began to leave, old Brother Peterson lingered behind. He helped Evelyn stack the chairs while I put away the literature. And then he turned to me with that same serious expression he had worn months earlier. "Brother Harold," he said quietly, "tomorrow is the last day of 1975. Are you ready?" I looked at this man who had trusted me, who had made his own sacrifices based partly on my encouragement, who was now looking to me for some kind of reassurance or explanation. "I'm ready for whatever Jehovah has planned, Brother Peterson," I replied, but the words felt like ashes in my mouth. The next morning, December 31st, 1975, I woke up before dawn and sat by our bedroom window, watching the sunrise on what I had been convinced for years would be one of the last days of this old system of things. As the hours passed, and the day proceeded exactly like every other day in human history, I felt something inside me begin to crack. Not break entirely, not yet, but crack in a way that would never fully heal. At midnight, as 1975 became 1976, Evelyn and I held each other in the darkness of our small apartment and tried not to think about what would happen next. Climax, January the 2nd, 1976. The first congregation meeting after 1975 had passed without incident. I sat in my usual spot in the front section, reserved for elders, looking out at faces that reflected my own confusion and disappointment. The Kingdom Hall felt different somehow, smaller, more ordinary, less charged with divine purpose than it had just days before. Brother William stepped up to the podium to deliver the opening remarks, and I could see the strain in his face. This man who had spoken with such confidence about 1975, who had encouraged so many life-altering decisions, now had to address a congregation full of people who had given up everything for a promise that hadn't materialized. "Dear brothers and sisters," he began, his voice lacking its usual authority, "we gather tonight to continue our worship of Jehovah, just as faithful servants have done throughout history, regardless of circumstances." The carefully chosen words hung in the air. No mention of 1975, no acknowledgement of the specific expectations that had driven our lives for the past 7 years. Just a generic call to continue worshipping, as if nothing significant had happened. But something significant had happened. The world had continued. People had gone to work on January 1st. Children had played in the snow. Governments had functioned. The wicked system that was supposed to be destroyed was still firmly in place, and we were still sitting in a rented building in Ohio, pretending that our faith hadn't been shaken to its core. During the intermission, I overheard fragments of whispered conversations that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. Sister Jenkins is having a nervous breakdown, someone murmured. She sold her house and gave the money to her children, thinking she wouldn't need it. Brother Martinez is trying to get his old job back, but they've already filled his position. The Thompson family is living in their car. They have nowhere to go. These weren't isolated cases. Throughout our circuit, families who had made radical sacrifices for 1975 were now facing the practical consequences of those decisions. And the organization's response was not compassion or acknowledgement of their role in encouraging these sacrifices. It was to quietly distance themselves from any specific predictions while continuing to insist that the end was still very near. 3 weeks later, I received a phone call that would change everything. It was from Brother Peterson, the man who had asked those difficult questions during our book study. "Harold," he said, his voice heavy with something I had never heard from him before, doubt. "I need to talk to you. Can you come over?" When I arrived at his modest home, I found him sitting at his kitchen table with a stack of old Watchtower magazines and assembly programs spread out in front of him. His wife, Sister Peterson, sat beside him with red-rimmed eyes that suggested she had been crying. "Harold," he said without preamble, "I've been going through everything the organization published about 1975, every magazine, every assembly talk, every book study, and I need you to explain something to me." He opened a 1968 Watchtower and began reading. "The Battle of Armageddon will be over. The abyssing of Satan and his demons will be accomplished." He looked up at me. "This was talking about 1975, Harold. Not maybe, not possibly. It was stating it as fact." My throat felt dry. "Brother Peterson, we need to be careful about—" "No," he interrupted, something he had never done in all the years I had known him. "I need you to listen to me, Harold. My wife and I sold our farm based on this. Our farm that had been in my family for 3 generations. We gave up our livelihood because we believed what you taught us, what the organization taught us." Sister Peterson spoke for the first time since I had arrived. "We're 68 years old, Harold. We have no savings, no property, no way to support ourselves, and now they're saying they never promised anything specific about 1975. I sat there in their small kitchen, feeling the weight of every talk I had given, every piece of counsel I had offered, every family I had encouraged to make radical changes for a date that had come and gone without incident. These people had trusted me. They had believed that I was speaking for God when I encouraged them to sell their farm. "I understand your frustration," I began, falling back on the standard responses I had been trained to give. "But we need to remember that our faith shouldn't depend on specific dates, even if our understanding of the timing wasn't perfect." "Stop!" Brother Peterson said, his voice sharp. "Just stop, Harold. Don't give me the party line. I want you to look me in the eye and tell me honestly, do you still believe that this organization speaks for God?" The question hit me like a physical blow. In that moment, sitting in the kitchen of people whose lives had been shattered by following the guidance I had given them, I couldn't find the automatic response that had always come so easily before. I started, then stopped. For the first time in 17 years as one of Jehovah's Witnesses, I couldn't immediately affirm that the organization was God's channel of communication. That silence stretched between us, and in it, I could feel something fundamental shifting inside me. It wasn't doubt about God or the Bible. It was doubt about the men in Brooklyn who claimed to speak for God. Doubt about the organization that had shaped every aspect of my life for nearly 2 decades. "Harold," Sister Peterson said gently, "we're not angry with you personally. We know you believed what you were teaching us, but we can't continue to pretend that this organization hasn't failed us. We can't keep waiting for the next prediction, the next adjustment in understanding, the next excuse for why things didn't happen the way they promised." I drove home that night in complete silence, my mind reeling from the conversation. When I walked into our apartment, Evelyn took one look at my face and knew something had changed. "What happened?" she asked. I told her about the Petersons, about their questions, about the magazines and assembly programs they had shown me. As I spoke, I could see the same recognition in her eyes that I was feeling. The recognition that we had been part of something that had caused tremendous harm to people we cared about. "Harold," she said quietly, "what are we going to do?" That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with questions that had been building for weeks, but that I had been afraid to fully acknowledge. If the organization could be so wrong about something they had taught with such certainty, what else might they be wrong about? If they were willing to let faithful people suffer, rather than take responsibility for their failed predictions, what did that say about their claim to be God's loving organization? The next morning, I made a decision that terrified me, but that I knew I had to make. I called Brother Williams and asked to meet with him privately. When we sat down in his living room that afternoon, I looked at this man who had been my mentor, my spiritual father, my guide into the organization's hierarchy. "Brother Williams," I said, my voice barely steady, "I need to know the truth about 1975. Not the official explanation, not the party line, the truth. Did we mislead people? Did we encourage them to make sacrifices for something we weren't certain about?" The look that crossed his face in that moment told me everything I needed to know. It was the look of a man who had been asking himself the same questions, a man who had been struggling with the same doubts, a man who was just as lost as I was, but couldn't admit it. "Harold," he said finally, "sometimes being faithful means accepting things we don't fully understand." But I couldn't accept that anymore. Not when I had seen the devastation in the Petersons' eyes, not when I knew that dozens of families in our circuit were facing similar situations, not when I realized that my own life had been built on what was beginning to look like a carefully constructed deception. That evening, for the first time in 17 years, I missed a congregation meeting. I sat in my apartment with Evelyn, and together we began to ask the questions that would ultimately cost us everything we thought we knew about ourselves, our faith, and our future. The weeks that followed were the most difficult of my life. Every day brought new revelations about the depth of the deception I had been living under, and every night brought sleepless hours of wrestling with the implications of what I was discovering. I began doing something I had never done in all my years as a witness. I started researching the organization's history independently. For 17 years, I had accepted everything the Watchtower published without question, trusting that the faithful and discreet slave was providing spiritual food at the proper time. Now, for the first time, I was looking beyond their publications to find out what others had written about Jehovah's Witnesses. The local library became my secret refuge. 3 times a week, I would drive there during the hours when I should have been preparing for meetings or studying Watchtower literature, and instead, I would pull books from the shelves that the organization had always warned us to avoid. Academic studies of religious movements, historical analyses of Bible prophecy, and most damaging of all, accounts by former witnesses of their experiences within the organization. What I discovered shattered what remained of my faith in the organization. 1975 wasn't the first failed prediction. It was just the most recent in a long series of dates that had come and gone without the promised end of the world. 1914, 1918, 1925, 1941, all had been proclaimed with the same certainty, the same scriptural backing, the same encouragement for followers to make radical life changes in preparation. "Evelyn," I said one evening after returning from another research session at the library, "we need to talk about what I've been learning." She looked up from the sewing she had been doing to earn a few extra dollars, work she had never needed to do when I was teaching and we owned our home. The sight of her weathered hands, made rough from the cleaning job she had taken to help us survive, filled me with a guilt so profound I could barely speak. "I've been reading about the organization's history," I continued, "and I think we've been deceived about more than just 1975. I told her about the previous failed predictions, about the changes in doctrine that the organization had made over the decades, about the pattern of blame shifting that occurred whenever their prophecies didn't come true. With each revelation, I could see the pain growing in her eyes, not just the pain of discovering we had been wrong, but the pain of realizing how much we had lost because of that wrongness. "Harold," she said finally, "if this is all true, what does it mean for us? What do we do now?" It was the question I had been dreading because I didn't have an answer. We had given up everything for the organization. Our home, my career, our financial security, our relationships with family members who weren't witnesses. If we left now, we would lose the only community we had known for nearly 2 decades. But if we stayed, we would be living a lie, continuing to teach others something we no longer believed. The pressure within the congregation was mounting as well. Other elders had begun to notice my absence from certain meetings, my lack of participation in the service arrangements, my obvious distraction during the programs I did attend. Brother Williams called me into a private meeting in February, ostensibly to discuss my spiritual health. "Harold," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his authority as presiding overseer, "several of the brothers have expressed concern about your recent attitude. You seem distant, troubled. Is there something you need to discuss with the body of elders?" The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Here was a man asking me to confess my doubts to a group of elders when those doubts were based on the organization's own failed teachings and his own promotion of those teachings. I could see the trap being set. Either I would confess my doubts and be labeled as spiritually weak or apostate, or I would lie and continue living as a hypocrite. "Brother Williams," I replied carefully, "I think many of us are still processing what happened with 1975. It's been difficult for some in the congregation to understand why things didn't work out as we expected." His face hardened immediately. "Harold, you know that the organization never set specific dates for Armageddon. Any brother who made assumptions beyond what was actually taught bears responsibility for his own disappointment." There it was. The blame shifting I had read about in my research happening right in front of me. The same man who had encouraged radical life changes based on 1975 expectations was now claiming that any problems were the fault of individual witnesses who had made assumptions. "With respect, Brother Williams," I said, feeling bolder than I had in months. "I remember the talks, the publications, the assembly programs. We were quite specific about what 1975 would bring." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken threats. I could see him weighing his options, how to handle an elder who was beginning to question the organization's version of recent history. "I think," he said finally, "that you would benefit from spending some time studying the recent Watchtower articles about maintaining faith during times of testing. Perhaps you should also consider whether you're in the right spiritual condition to continue serving as an elder." The message was clear: conform or face the consequences. But I was beyond the point where such threats could influence me. I had seen too much, learned too much, lost too much to simply fall back in line. That night I made a decision that would change the trajectory of the rest of my life. I told Evelyn that I could no longer continue serving as an elder in good conscience, and that I thought we needed to seriously consider leaving the organization entirely. "But Harold," she said, tears streaming down her face, "if we leave, we'll lose everyone we know. Our friends, our community, our entire way of life. Where will we go? What will we do?" She was right, of course. The organization had been our entire world for so long that we had no social connections outside of it. Leaving would mean starting over completely at ages 49 and 46, with no savings, no home, and no support system. But staying would mean continuing to live a lie, continuing to teach others things we no longer believed, continuing to be complicit in an organization that we now knew had caused tremendous harm to faithful people like the Petersons. The next week, I submitted a letter to the body of elders requesting to be removed from my position. I didn't explain my reasons in detail. I knew that any criticism of the organization would be seen as apostasy and would result in immediate disfellowshipping. Instead, I simply stated that I felt I needed to step down due to personal circumstances. The response was swift and predictable. Within days, I was called before a judicial committee to explain my decision. 3 elders, including Brother Williams, sat across from me in the back room of the Kingdom Hall, where I had participated in so many similar proceedings over the years. "Brother Harold," Brother Williams began, "your request to step down as an elder has raised some concerns. We need to understand your motives and ensure that there are no doctrinal issues involved." For over 2 hours they questioned me about my beliefs, my loyalty to the organization, my commitment to the truth. I tried to navigate the interrogation carefully, neither lying about my doubts nor being so honest that they would have grounds to disfellowship me immediately. But I could see that they suspected the truth. These men had known me for years, had worked closely with me, had seen my transformation from enthusiastic believer to troubled questioner. They knew that something fundamental had changed in my relationship with the organization. "Harold," one of the other elders said near the end of the meeting, "do you still believe that this is God's organization on earth?" The question hung in the air between us. In that moment, I faced the choice that every witness who begins to doubt must eventually face: lie to preserve your standing in the community, or tell the truth and lose everything. I looked at these 3 men I had served alongside for years, men who had been my friends and spiritual brothers, and I realized that I couldn't lie anymore. "I have questions," I said finally, "serious questions about some of the organization's teachings and practices." The atmosphere in the room changed immediately. I could see them exchanging glances, making mental notes, preparing for the next phase of what I now understood was essentially a religious trial. "What kind of questions?" Brother Williams asked, his voice taking on the coldly judicial tone I had heard him use with others who had fallen under suspicion. And in that moment, I made the decision that would cost me everything I had built over the previous 17 years, but would also begin the process of reclaiming my integrity and my freedom. "Questions about 1975, I said clearly. "Questions about the organization's history of failed prophecies. Questions about whether men who make so many mistakes can really claim to speak for God." The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know about how this would end. But for the first time in months, I felt something I had almost forgotten: the relief of telling the truth, regardless of the consequences. Within a week, I would be officially reproved and stripped of all privileges in the congregation. Within a month, Evelyn and I would make the decision to stop attending meetings entirely. And within 6 months, we would be officially disfellowshipped and cut off from every relationship we had built during our years as Jehovah's Witnesses. But that night, walking home from the Kingdom Hall after my judicial committee meeting, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the beginning of genuine freedom. Today, as I sit here at 74 years old, I can look back on the past 46 years since leaving the Jehovah's Witnesses with a perspective that only time and distance can provide. The journey from that broken man who walked away from everything he thought he knew to the person I am today has been long, difficult, but ultimately liberating. The first few years after our disfellowshipping were the hardest Evelyn and I had ever experienced. We were middle-aged people starting completely over, with no savings, no home, no career prospects, and no social support system. The organization had trained us to see the outside world as dangerous and hostile, so even simple things like making new friends or finding a new community felt overwhelming. I was fortunate to find work as a substitute teacher, which eventually led to a full-time position at a small high school about 30 miles from where we had lived as witnesses. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was returning to the profession I had abandoned for the organization's false promises. But this time, I appreciated the work in a way I hadn't before. Teaching became not just a job, but a form of healing, a way to contribute something positive to the world after years of promoting what I now knew had been harmful teachings. Evelyn struggled more than I did initially. She had given up her prime years to the organization, had sacrificed the possibility of having children because we believed the end was so near. At 48, she faced the reality that many of her dreams would never be fulfilled. But she also discovered strength she hadn't known she possessed. She went back to school, earned a nursing degree, and spent the next 20 years caring for elderly patients in a local hospital. "Harold," she said to me one evening, about 5 years after we had left, "I used to think that serving Jehovah was the most meaningful thing I could do with my life. But taking care of Mrs. Thompson today as she was dying, holding her hand and helping her feel less afraid, that felt more genuinely spiritual than anything I ever did knocking on doors." That conversation marked a turning point for both of us. We began to understand that the organization hadn't just stolen our money and our security. It had stolen our understanding of what genuine spirituality and service to others actually looked like. We started attending a small Methodist church, not because we were looking for another religious organization to follow, but because we needed community and we wanted to explore what healthy faith might look like. The pastor there, Reverend Johnson, was nothing like the authoritarian elders we had known. He encouraged questions, admitted when he didn't know something, and never claimed to have exclusive access to God's truth. "The moment any religious leader tells you they're the only way to God," he said during one of his sermons, "that's the moment you should start running in the opposite direction." Those words resonated deeply with me. I thought about all the years I had spent telling people that only Jehovah's Witnesses would survive Armageddon, that only our organization had God's approval, that questioning our teachings was tantamount to questioning God himself. The arrogance and spiritual abuse inherent in those claims became crystal clear. Over the years, we reconnected with some family members we had shunned during our time as witnesses. My brother Tom, whom I hadn't spoken to in over a decade because he had refused to study with the witnesses, welcomed us back into his life with a grace I didn't deserve. Evelyn's sister Margaret, who had been heartbroken when we cut off contact due to her worldly lifestyle, forgave us and helped us rebuild relationships we had thought were lost forever. The most difficult part of our recovery was learning to trust our own judgment again. The organization had trained us to distrust our own thoughts and feelings, to always defer to their authority on every aspect of life. Learning to make decisions based on our own values and reasoning, rather than waiting for direction from a religious hierarchy, took years of conscious effort. I began writing about our experience in the late 1980s, first just for my own processing, then for small publications that helped other former witnesses. The letters I received from people who read my articles were both heartbreaking and encouraging. Heartbreaking because they revealed how many others had been hurt by the organization. Encouraging because they showed how many people were finding the courage to leave and rebuild their lives. One letter particularly stands out in my memory. It was from a woman named Sarah who wrote, "Brother Harold, I remember you from the circuit assemblies in the 1970s. You gave a talk about making sacrifices for 1975, and my family sold our farm based partly on your encouragement. I want you to know that I don't blame you personally. I know you believed what you were teaching, but I also want you to know that your article about leaving the organization helped me find the courage to get out with my own children before they wasted their entire lives like I did." Reading that letter, I felt the complex mixture of guilt and redemption that has characterized much of my post-witness life. I couldn't undo the harm I had caused as an elder, but I could try to help others avoid the same mistakes. Evelyn passed away 3 years ago after a brief battle with cancer. Even in her final days, she expressed gratitude for our decision to leave the organization, despite all the pain it had caused. "Harold," she whispered to me during one of our last conversations, "can you imagine if we had stayed? We would have wasted our entire lives waiting for a promise that was never going to come true. Today, I live in a small apartment near my nephew's family. I volunteer at a local literacy center, helping adults learn to read. Adults who often remind me of the sincere, searching people I used to encounter during my door-to-door preaching days. The difference is that now I'm helping them develop skills that will genuinely improve their lives, rather than trying to convert them to an organization that would ultimately control and manipulate them. I still believe in God, though my understanding of spirituality is far different from what it was during my witness years. I believe God is found in acts of genuine love and service, in the courage to stand up for truth even when it's costly, in the grace to forgive those who have hurt us, and the wisdom to protect ourselves from being hurt again. To anyone watching this who might be struggling with doubts about the Jehovah's Witnesses, I want you to know that your doubts are valid, your questions are legitimate. Your concerns about the organization's history, their failed prophecies, their authoritarian control over members' lives, these are not signs of spiritual weakness or satanic influence. They are signs of a healthy mind beginning to recognize manipulation and deception. Leaving won't be easy. You may lose relationships, financial security, and your entire social structure. But you will gain something infinitely more valuable: your freedom, your integrity, and your ability to live according to your own conscience, rather than the dictates of men who claim to speak for God. The promise that never came taught me the most important lesson of my life. No human organization, no matter how convincing their claims, has the right to control your relationship with the divine or dictate the terms of your existence. Freedom, I learned, is worth any price you have to pay for it. This is a real story, shared by one of our subscribers. Thank you so much for trusting us with it. If you also have a story you'd like to share, write in the comments. We'll be very happy to tell your story on our channel.